The security guard's flashlight beam cut through the darkness of the abandoned factory floor, landing on a small figure hunched over a massive machine that hadn't worked in 15 years. Keisha Williams, 17 years old with her hair tied back in a faded bandana, didn't even look up when the light hit her. Her dark hands moved with surprising confidence over rusted metal and tangled wires, completely absorbed in her work. The guard's radio crackled to life. "Johnson, you find anything down there? Corporate's been getting reports of lights in the old aerospace building." Keisha's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept working. She'd been coming here for 3 months now, ever since she'd discovered the old rocket engine prototype gathering dust in the basement of Peterson Aerospace. The same company where her mama had cleaned offices for 23 years. The same company that had laid off half their engineering team and abandoned this project when funding dried up. "Just some rats," Johnson's voice echoed through the empty space. "Building's been empty so long, probably just reflections from the street lights." Keisha held her breath, crouched behind the engine's massive frame. Her backpack sat nearby, filled with books she'd borrowed from the library and tools she'd borrowed from the high school shop class. Tools she wasn't supposed to have. Books about rocket propulsion and engine design that most people would say were too advanced for a girl like her. The footsteps moved away, but Keisha stayed frozen. She thought about her mama, Denise, who would be finishing her shift at the main Peterson building right about now. Emptying trash cans in offices where engineers made more in a month than her mama made in a year. Cleaning desks covered with blueprints and calculations that fascinated Keisha more than anything else in the world. Growing up, Keisha had spent countless hours in those offices while her mama worked late shifts. She'd memorized every poster on the walls, every equation scribbled on whiteboards. She'd watched through windows as teams of engineers worked on problems that seemed impossible. And she'd dreamed of being one of them. But dreams were expensive things for a girl from the south side of Chicago whose daddy had left when she was 3, and whose mama worked 2 jobs just to keep their apartment. Dreams were for people who could afford college applications and SAT prep courses. Dreams were for people who belonged in those clean, bright offices instead of hiding in abandoned basements. Still, here she was. The engine loomed above her in the darkness, a beast of metal and complexity that had cost Peterson Aerospace millions of dollars before they'd given up on it. According to the research she'd done, it was supposed to be revolutionary. A new type of propulsion system that could make space travel cheaper and safer. But something had gone wrong. The engine had never worked properly, and after 2 years of failed tests, the project was shelved. Keisha had read every report she could find, studied every technical document that had been carelessly left in recycling bins. She'd even managed to access some of the old computer files when she'd helped her mama with weekend cleaning shifts. And she'd noticed something that the engineers had missed. A small error in the fuel mixture calculations that would cause exactly the kind of problems they'd been having. The security guard's footsteps faded completely. Keisha pulled out her phone and used its flashlight to examine the engine's fuel injection system. Her hands shook slightly as she made the final adjustment she'd been working on for weeks. It was a simple fix, really. Just a matter of recalibrating the mixture ratios and adjusting the timing sequence. But simple didn't mean easy. She'd had to teach herself advanced chemistry and engineering principles that college students struggled with. She'd had to find ways to test her theories without expensive equipment. She'd had to overcome her own fear that she was crazy for thinking she could solve a problem that had stumped teams of professional engineers. As she worked, Keisha thought about her mama's words from that morning. "Baby, you're smart enough to do anything you set your mind to. Don't let nobody tell you different." Denise Williams had been saying things like that for as long as Keisha could remember. Even when teachers overlooked her in favor of students whose parents donated to the school. Even when guidance counselors suggested she focus on more realistic career paths. Even when other kids made fun of her for reading engineering textbooks instead of fashion magazines. Her mama had never finished high school herself, but she understood the value of education. She'd sacrificed everything to make sure Keisha had opportunities she'd never had. Working nights and weekends, skipping meals to pay for Keisha's books and supplies, believing in her daughter's potential even when the world seemed determined to ignore it. the memory strengthened Keisha's resolve. She made the final connection and stepped back from the engine. According to her calculations, it should work now. The fuel would mix properly, the combustion would be stable, and the thrust would be exactly what the original designers had intended. But she wouldn't know for sure until she tested it. Keisha gathered her tools and stuffed them back into her backpack. She'd return tomorrow night with the equipment she needed to run a proper test. If she was right, this engine would prove that she belonged in those clean, bright offices. If she was wrong, well, at least she'd tried. As she prepared to leave, Keisha took one last look at the engine. In the dim light from her phone, it looked almost alive. Waiting. Ready to either fulfill her dreams or destroy them completely. She'd find out which one tomorrow. The next evening, Keisha's hands trembled as she connected the last wire to her makeshift testing apparatus. She'd spent the entire day gathering equipment, borrowing items from the school's chemistry lab and electronics shop. Her teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had asked questions about her sudden interest in advanced projects, but Keisha had managed to deflect them with vague answers about college applications. The truth was too complicated to explain. How could she tell anyone about her secret visits to the abandoned factory? How could she describe the certainty she felt that she could fix something that had baffled professional engineers? How could she make them understand that this wasn't just about proving herself anymore, but about proving something bigger? The engine sat silent in the darkness, waiting for her to make the final connection. Keisha had spent weeks preparing for this moment, calculating and recalculating every variable. She'd run simulations in her head, imagined every possible outcome. But now, faced with the reality of actually testing her theory, doubt crept in. What if she was wrong? What if her calculations were off by just enough to cause a malfunction? The engine was designed to be tested in a proper facility with safety protocols and backup systems. Here, in this abandoned basement, there were no safety nets. If something went wrong, it would be just her and several tons of potentially explosive machinery. But backing down now would mean giving up on everything she'd worked for. It would mean accepting that she was just a janitor's daughter who didn't belong in the world of engineering and innovation. It would mean letting down her mama, who had sacrificed so much to give her opportunities. Keisha took a deep breath and made the final connection. The engine's control panel flickered to life, displaying readings that hadn't been seen in 15 years. Fuel pressure, ignition timing, combustion chamber temperature, everything was within normal parameters. Keisha's modifications had integrated perfectly with the original systems. She initiated the startup sequence, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it over the hum of machinery. The engine began its pre-ignition cycle, and Keisha stepped back to a safe distance. If her calculations were correct, the engine would achieve stable combustion within 30 seconds. If they were wrong, the results could be catastrophic. 10 seconds. The fuel began flowing through the injection system, mixing in precise ratios that Keisha had spent months perfecting. 20 seconds. The ignition sequence began, sending carefully timed sparks into the combustion chamber. 25 seconds. A low rumble filled the basement as the engine came to life. 30 seconds. The rumble smoothed into a steady roar as the engine achieved stable combustion for the first time in 15 years. Keisha stared at the control panel in amazement. Every reading was perfect. The thrust output was exactly what the original specifications had called for. The fuel efficiency was even better than the engineers had hoped. Her fix had worked. But her celebration was cut short by new sounds from above. Footsteps, voices, the jingling of keys. The security guard was back, and this time he wasn't alone. "I'm telling you, there's something going on down there," Johnson's voice carried through the ceiling. "That's not rats making that noise." Keisha's mind raced. She needed to shut down the engine and get out, but the proper shutdown sequence would take several minutes. If she cut power suddenly, she might damage the delicate systems she'd spent so long repairing. More voices joined the conversation above. She heard the word police and felt her stomach drop. Getting caught here would mean more than just trespassing charges. It would mean the end of her dreams, the end of her chance to prove that she belonged in the world of engineering. The engine continued its steady roar, beautiful and terrible at the same time. Keisha began the shutdown sequence, her fingers flying over controls she'd memorized from technical manuals. Each step had to be perfect, each timing precise. One mistake could destroy everything she'd accomplished. The footsteps were getting closer. She could hear them on the stairs now, multiple sets of feet moving toward the basement level. The security guard was talking to someone on his radio, reporting an unauthorized presence in the building. Keisha's mind worked frantically as she continued the shutdown procedure. She needed a plan, a way to explain what she was doing here without revealing how much she knew about the engine. But every explanation she could think of sounded ridiculous. What 17-year-old girl would break into an abandoned aerospace facility to work on rocket engines? The engine's roar began to fade as the shutdown sequence progressed. Keisha gathered her tools and stuffed them into her backpack, erasing as much evidence of her presence as possible. But she couldn't erase the fact that the engine had been running. Couldn't erase the heat signatures and residual readings that would be obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. The footsteps reached the basement level. Flashlight beams swept across the floor, searching for the source of the noise they'd heard. Keisha crouched behind the engine, her heart hammering against her ribs. "There." Johnson's voice echoed through the space. "I can see someone back there." The beams converged on her hiding spot. Keisha knew she was caught, but she couldn't bring herself to move. This had been her sanctuary, her place of possibility. Leaving it would mean returning to a world where she was just another face in the crowd, another smart kid from the wrong side of town whose dreams were too big for her circumstances. "Come out slowly," another voice called. "Keep your hands where we can see them." Keisha stood up slowly, her backpack clutched in her hands. The flashlight beams were blinding, but she could make out shapes behind them. Security guards, maybe police officers. People who would see her as a criminal instead of an engineer. "Well, well." Johnson's voice was full of satisfaction. "Looks like we caught ourselves a little vandal." But as the men approached, one of them stopped suddenly. His flashlight beam had fallen on the engine's control panel, which was still displaying the residual readings from its successful test run. "Wait a minute," the man said, his voice changing from authority to confusion. "This engine, it's been running." The man behind the flashlight stepped closer to the control panel, his beam illuminating displays that showed clear evidence of recent operation. Keisha could see him now, a tall black man in his 50s wearing a Peterson Aerospace security uniform. But something about his bearings suggested he was more than just a guard. "This is impossible," he muttered, studying the readings. "This engine hasn't worked in 15 years. Johnson moved to join him, his own flashlight beam dancing across the control surfaces. "What are you talking about, Morrison? It's just some old machine." "This isn't just some old machine," Morrison replied, his voice filled with something that might have been awe. "This is the X-47 prototype. I helped design it before they shut down the project." Keisha's breath caught in her throat. Morrison was an engineer, not just a security guard. She'd read his name in some of the technical documents she'd studied. He'd been one of the lead designers on the project before Peterson had laid off their entire advanced propulsion team. "I don't understand," Johnson said, clearly uncomfortable with the technical discussion. "The kid was just vandalizing the place, right?" Morrison's flashlight beam moved from the control panel to Keisha, and she found herself looking into the eyes of someone who understood exactly what she'd been doing. His expression was unreadable, somewhere between suspicion and curiosity. "Young lady," Morrison said carefully, "do you know what this machine is?" Keisha nodded, not trusting her voice. Her throat felt dry, and her hands were shaking. "Do you know what these readings mean?" Another nod. Morrison studied her for a long moment, then turned back to the control panel. He began pressing buttons and checking displays with the familiarity of someone who'd spent years working on this exact system. "The fuel mixture ratios," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "They're different from our original specifications." He looked back at Keisha, his expression becoming more intense. "Did you modify this engine?" Keisha found her voice. though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "I fixed it." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Johnson laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the basement. A kid fixed something that a whole team of engineers couldn't? Come on, Morrison. She's just messing around with buttons. But Morrison wasn't laughing. He was staring at Keisha with an expression she'd never seen before, the look of someone who was beginning to understand that something extraordinary had just happened. "The combustion instability problem," Morrison said slowly. "We never could solve it. The fuel would burn unevenly, causing pressure fluctuations that made the engine unreliable. I recalibrated the injection timing," Keisha said, her voice growing stronger. "The original calculations assumed a linear burn rate, but the fuel mixture actually burns in a spiral pattern. You needed to adjust the injection sequence to match the natural combustion flow." Morrison's flashlight beam dropped to the floor as he stared at her in amazement. Behind him, Johnson was looking back and forth between them like he was watching a conversation in a foreign language. "You figured that out from the technical documentation?" Morrison asked. "That and some additional research," Keisha admitted. "I've been studying the problem for months." Morrison moved to another control panel and began checking additional readings. Every display confirmed what Keisha had told him. The engine had not only run successfully but had performed better than the original specifications had predicted. "This is incredible," Morrison said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "We spent 2 years trying to solve this problem. We had teams of engineers, computer simulations, millions of dollars in testing equipment. And you figured it out in your spare time." Keisha felt a warmth spreading through her chest, a feeling she'd never experienced before. For the first time in her life, someone who understood engineering was looking at her work with respect instead of surprise. "Who taught you to do this?" Morrison asked. "Nobody," Keisha said. "I taught myself. I borrowed books from the library, studied online courses, practiced with electronics projects at school." Morrison shook his head in amazement. "This is graduate-level work. Hell, this is professional-level work. What's your name?" "Keisha Williams," she said, then added quickly, "My mama works here. She's a janitor in the main building." Something shifted in Morrison's expression, a flicker of recognition. "Denise Williams? The woman who works the night shift?" Keisha nodded, surprised that he knew her mother. "I've met her," Morrison said. "She's been here longer than most of the engineers. Always polite, always professional. She's talked about her daughter before, said she was smart, interested in science." The pride in his voice when he mentioned her mama made Keisha's eyes water. She'd never heard anyone speak about her mother with that kind of respect before. "I think you should call her," Morrison said. "She should know what her daughter has accomplished." "Sir," Johnson interrupted, "we still have a security breach to deal with. The kid was trespassing, regardless of what she was doing." Morrison looked at Johnson with an expression that suggested he was remembering something important about authority and hierarchy. But when he turned back to Keisha, his face was kind. "Johnson's right about the trespassing," Morrison said. "You shouldn't be here without permission. But what you've done, this changes everything." He pulled out his phone and began dialing a number. "I'm calling the head of engineering. Dr. Patricia Coleman needs to see this immediately." Keisha felt a new wave of panic. Dr. Coleman was a legend in the aerospace industry, a brilliant engineer who had designed some of the most advanced propulsion systems in the world. The thought of meeting her was both thrilling and terrifying. "Maybe we should wait," Keisha said nervously. "I mean, it's late, and I should probably get home." "No," Morrison said firmly. "This can't wait. Do you understand what you've done here? You've solved a problem that cost this company millions of dollars. You've proven that this engine design is viable. This could revolutionize space travel." As Morrison continued his phone call, Keisha found herself thinking about her mama, who would be finishing her shift soon. Denise Williams, who had cleaned offices and emptied trash cans for 23 years while dreaming of better things for her daughter. who had sacrificed everything to give Keisha opportunities she'd never had. Soon, Keisha thought, her mama would learn that all those sacrifices had been worth it. Dr. Patricia Coleman arrived at the facility 30 minutes later, accompanied by 2 other engineers and a woman in an expensive suit who introduced herself as the company's legal counsel. Keisha sat in the basement, surrounded by people who represented everything she'd dreamed of becoming, and felt smaller than she ever had in her life. Dr. Coleman was younger than Keisha had expected, maybe 45, with natural hair pulled back in a practical style and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She moved around the X-47 engine with the confidence of someone who understood its every component, checking displays and making notes on a tablet. "These readings are extraordinary," Dr. Coleman said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. "The engine performed beyond our original specifications." She turned to Keisha, who was standing awkwardly near the wall, still clutching her backpack. "Mr. Morrison tells me you're responsible for this." Keisha nodded, not trusting her voice. "Show me what you did," Dr. Coleman said. For the next hour, Keisha walked Dr. Coleman through her modifications, explaining her reasoning and demonstrating her calculations. She pulled out her notebook, filled with equations and diagrams that she'd worked on for months. She showed the research she'd done, the problems she'd identified, the solutions she'd developed. Dr. Coleman listened intently, asking technical questions that pushed Keisha to explain her work in greater detail. The other engineers took notes, their expressions shifting from skepticism to amazement as they realized the depth of Keisha's understanding. "This is remarkable work," Dr. Coleman said finally. "You've identified and solved a problem that our best engineers couldn't crack." But then her expression became more serious. "However, we have some significant issues to address. You've been trespassing on company property, accessing confidential technical information, and working with dangerous equipment without proper safety protocols." The legal counsel stepped forward, her voice crisp and professional. "The company could pursue criminal charges for industrial espionage, breaking and entering, and theft of proprietary information." Keisha felt the floor drop out from under her. Industrial espionage? She'd been trying to prove herself, not steal anything. She'd been trying to solve problems, not create them. "I didn't steal anything," Keisha said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to understand how it worked." "You accessed confidential technical documents," the legal counsel continued. "You used company resources without authorization. You compromised building security. These are serious legal violations." Morrison stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "She's 17 years old, and she just solved a problem that's been plaguing this company for years. Are you really going to prosecute a kid for being too smart?" "The law doesn't recognize age as a defense for corporate espionage," the legal counsel replied coolly. Dr. Coleman held up a hand to stop the argument. "There's another issue we need to address," she said, looking directly at Keisha. "How did you gain access to the technical documentation for this project?" Keisha's heart sank. She'd been dreading this question, knowing that answering it would implicate her mother. But she couldn't lie, not now. "Some of the documents were in recycling bins," Keisha said slowly. "I found them when I was helping my mama with her cleaning shifts." "And the computer files?" Keisha's voice became even quieter. "I accessed them from terminals in the offices. When Mama was cleaning, I would look at the files that were still open." The legal counsel's expression became predatory. "So you used your mother's access to steal confidential information. That makes her an accessory to corporate espionage." "No." Keisha's voice cracked with emotion. "My mama doesn't know anything about this. She never helped me, never told me to do it. She doesn't even know I've been coming here. But the damage was done." Keisha could see the calculation in the legal counsel's eyes, the recognition that they now had leverage over both her and her mother. Denise Williams, who had worked faithfully for Peterson Aerospace for 23 years, could lose her job and face criminal charges because of her daughter's actions. "I think we need to call Mrs. Williams," Dr. Coleman said quietly. "She has a right to know what's happening." Keisha closed her eyes, imagining her mama's face when she learned what had happened. The disappointment, the fear, the realization that her daughter had jeopardized everything they'd worked for. Morrison was arguing with the legal counsel, his voice rising with frustration. This is insane. You're talking about prosecuting a teenager and her mother for what amounts to the most brilliant piece of engineering analysis this company has seen in years. The manner of the analysis is irrelevant, the legal counsel replied. The law is clear about unauthorized access to proprietary information. Dr. Coleman's phone rang, interrupting the argument. She answered it, speaking in low tones to someone who was clearly important. The conversation lasted several minutes, and when she hung up, her expression was unreadable. That was the CEO, Dr. Coleman announced. He's on his way here personally. He wants to see the engine test results and meet the person responsible for this breakthrough. Keisha felt a new wave of panic. The CEO of Peterson Aerospace was coming to meet her. A man who controlled the fates of thousands of employees, who made decisions that affected entire industries. A man who had the power to destroy her family's life with a single word. In the meantime, Dr. Coleman continued, I think we should call Mrs. Williams. She should be here when the CEO arrives. 20 minutes later, Keisha heard familiar footsteps on the basement stairs. Her mama appeared in the doorway, still wearing her cleaning uniform, her face etched with worry and confusion. Keisha. Denise Williams looked around the basement, taking in the engine, the engineers, the legal counsel, and finally her daughter. Baby, what's going on? Keisha felt tears building in her eyes as she looked at her mother. Denise Williams, who had worked so hard to give her daughter opportunities. Who had sacrificed everything to support Keisha's dreams. Who was about to learn that those dreams had turned into a nightmare that could destroy both their lives. Mama, Keisha whispered. I'm so sorry. Denise Williams stood in the doorway of the basement, her cleaning supplies still in hand, staring at the scene before her with growing understanding. Her daughter, surrounded by engineers and lawyers, looked smaller and more vulnerable than she'd ever seen her. But there was something else in Keisha's posture, something that suggested defiance rather than defeat. Mrs. Williams, Dr. Coleman said, stepping forward with professional courtesy. Thank you for coming. We need to discuss some serious matters regarding your daughter's activities. Denise set down her cleaning supplies and moved to stand beside Keisha, her presence immediately making her daughter feel less alone. What kind of activities? The legal counsel began to speak, but Dr. Coleman held up a hand to stop her. Perhaps we should let Keisha explain. For the next several minutes, Keisha told her mother everything. About the nights she'd spent in the basement, about the technical documents she'd studied, about the months of research and calculation that had led to this moment. She explained how she'd identified the problem with the X-47 engine and developed a solution that had eluded teams of professional engineers. Denise listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from concern to amazement to something that might have been pride. When Keisha finished, the basement fell silent except for the distant hum of building systems. So you fixed their engine, Denise said finally, her voice carrying a note of wonder. My baby girl fixed $1 million rocket engine. Mrs. Williams, the legal counsel interjected, your daughter gained access to confidential information through your security clearance. That makes you legally responsible for. No, Denise said firmly, cutting her off. My security clearance is for cleaning offices, not for accessing technical files. If Keisha looked at documents, that was her choice, not mine. Morrison stepped forward, his face animated with passion. Mrs. Williams, you should be proud of your daughter. What she's accomplished here is extraordinary. She's solved a problem that could revolutionize space travel. I am proud of her, Denise said, putting her arm around Keisha's shoulders. I've always been proud of her. But I'm also worried about what this means for her future. Before anyone could respond, new footsteps echoed on the stairs. A group of people in expensive suits descended into the basement, led by a distinguished-looking man in his 60s. Keisha recognized him immediately from company photographs. James Peterson, CEO and founder of Peterson Aerospace. Dr. Coleman, Peterson said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding rooms full of important people. I understand we have a rather unusual situation here. Dr. Coleman quickly briefed Peterson on the situation, explaining Keisha's breakthrough and the legal complications that had arisen. Peterson listened intently, his sharp eyes moving between Keisha and the engine controls. "Show me the test results," Peterson said. Dr. Coleman pulled up the data on her tablet, displaying the engine performance readings that Keisha had achieved. Peterson studied them for several minutes, his expression becoming increasingly amazed. "These numbers are incredible," Peterson said finally. "The fuel efficiency alone would save us millions on every mission." He turned to Keisha, his gaze intense but not unkind. "You're 17 years old?" "Yes, sir," Keisha managed to say. "And you taught yourself advanced rocket engineering from library books and online courses?" "Yes, sir." Peterson shook his head in amazement. "In 40 years of running this company, I've never seen anything like this. The technical skill, the creative problem-solving, the sheer audacity of what you've accomplished." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "However, the legal issues are significant. You've accessed proprietary information, trespassed on company property, and potentially exposed us to liability concerns." The legal counsel stepped forward, sensing an opportunity. "Sir, we could pursue criminal charges for corporate espionage. It would send a clear message about protecting our intellectual property." Peterson's expression became cold as he looked at the legal counsel. "You want to prosecute a teenager for being too smart?" "The law is clear about unauthorized access." "The law," Peterson interrupted, "is also clear about the difference between malicious intent and intellectual curiosity. This young woman didn't steal our secrets to sell to competitors. She didn't sabotage our equipment or compromise our security. She identified a problem and fixed it." He turned back to Keisha, his expression softening. "What do you want to do with your life, Miss Williams?" "I want to be an engineer," Keisha said, her voice growing stronger. "I want to design engines and spacecraft and solve problems that people think are impossible." Peterson nodded slowly. "And you, Mrs. Williams? What do you want for your daughter?" Denise looked at Keisha with an expression of pure love and pride. "I want her to have opportunities one never had. I want her to use her gifts to make the world better." Peterson was quiet for a long moment, clearly thinking through the implications of what he was about to say. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decision that would change everything. "Miss Williams," Peterson said, "I'm prepared to offer you a full scholarship to any engineering school you choose. Additionally, I'd like to offer you a position as a paid intern here at Peterson Aerospace, working directly with Dr. Coleman on advanced propulsion systems." Keisha's mouth fell open. She looked at her mother, who was staring at Peterson with amazement. "Furthermore," Peterson continued, "I'm prepared to offer your mother a position as a facilities coordinator, with a salary commensurate with her years of service and her obvious integrity." The legal counsel started to object, but Peterson silenced her with a look. "The only condition," Peterson said, "is that you agree to work exclusively with us on any future developments of your engine modifications. This technology is too valuable to risk losing to competitors." Keisha felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in hours, they were tears of joy rather than fear. She looked at her mother, who was crying too, and saw a future that neither of them had dared to imagine. "Yes, sir," Keisha said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, sir, I accept." Peterson smiled, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, Keisha felt like she could breathe again. 3 months later, Keisha Williams stood in the control room of Peterson Aerospace's main testing facility, watching as the X-47 engine completed its 20th successful test run. She wore a white lab coat with "Junior Engineer" embroidered on the pocket, and her hair was pulled back in the same practical style she'd seen Dr. Coleman wear. Beside her, Dr. Coleman was reviewing test data on a tablet, making notes about performance parameters and efficiency ratings. The engine that had once been abandoned in a basement was now the centerpiece of Peterson's most ambitious space program. Excellent work, Keisha, Dr. Coleman said, looking up from her tablet. The modifications you've made to the fuel injection system have improved performance by another 3%. Through the control room windows, Keisha could see her mother in the adjacent office, working at a desk covered with facilities reports and maintenance schedules. Denise Williams had adapted to her new role as facilities coordinator with the same dedication she'd brought to her cleaning work, but now she was making decisions instead of just following orders. Dr. Coleman, Keisha said, I've been thinking about the combustion chamber design. I think we might be able to improve efficiency even more if we modify the shape of the intake valves. Dr. Coleman smiled, the expression of a mentor watching her student surpass expectations. Show me your calculations. As Keisha pulled out her notebook, filled with equations and diagrams that would have seemed impossible just months ago, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. From a teenager hiding in an abandoned basement to a junior engineer, working on cutting-edge technology that would help humanity reach for the stars. The engine roared to life for another test run, its sound no longer frightening but beautiful. The sound of dreams becoming reality, of barriers being broken, of a future that was limited only by imagination and determination. Keisha Williams, daughter of a janitor, had fixed more than just an engine. She had fixed the trajectory of her entire life. And this was only the beginning.